The bog out past Hassell had been written off by every man in Bertie County, North Carolina, for longer than most of them could remember. Locals called it Spivey's Folly, after a landowner 3 generations back who'd lost a small fortune trying to drain it for farmland and given up somewhere around his second mortgage. The failed ditch line still visible from the air if a person knew where to look, grown over with the same shrub bog they'd once been dug to drain. The county had carried all 700 acres of it on the tax rolls ever since, as a kind of standing joke, a parcel nobody wanted, and the county couldn't quite bring itself to stop owning. Every man who'd ever walked that ground and priced it out had come to the same conclusion. And every one of them was wrong about what it was actually worth. The one person in Bertie County who saw it differently wasn't a man at all, and she didn't own a single acre of farmland, a tractor, or much of anything else. The morning she showed up to the county surplus auction with a torn $20 bill folded into her coat pocket, and not much else to her name. Hazel Tillery had run the Register of Deeds office in Windsor for going on 15 years, and she'd watched Spivey's Folly come up on that same surplus list every single auction, without anybody so much as glancing at the listing twice. She processed the recording fee for it most years without even looking up from her desk, the same way she processed 100 other small, forgettable transactions in a county that size. She watched it happen differently that October. She didn't understand, that morning, what exactly she was watching, standing near the back with a clipboard of her own, mostly there to make sure the paperwork on the day's sales got filed correctly before the office closed. She had a fair idea of it inside a year. Stories like this one don't get told much anymore. The slow kind, the kind where the woman at the back of the room turns out to know something the whole county missed for 60 years running. The kind that takes a full year of mud and paperwork to pay off instead of a single dramatic afternoon. If you grew up around people who paid closer attention than anybody gave them credit for, hit subscribe. We're going to keep telling them as long as you keep watching. Bertie County sits low and flat along the Roanoke River in the coastal plain of eastern North Carolina, the kind of ground where the line between farmland and swamp has never been especially tidy. The county seat of Windsor held its surplus property auction every October on the courthouse lawn. A modest affair compared to the equipment sales further inland, mostly small parcels the county had picked up through decades of unpaid back taxes. Odd lots too small, or too wet, or too landlocked for anybody to want at full price. A church group sold sweet tea and boiled peanuts from a folding table near the steps, the same fundraiser they ran every auction day, and most of the men standing around waiting for the better lots knew each other well enough to spend the slow stretches talking about deer season instead of the parcels themselves. Spivey's Folly anchored the bottom of that list most years. 700 acres of Poquoson wetland, a thick, low shrub bog the locals had never had much use for beyond hunting leases and the occasional bear sighting that made the local paper. The morning had turned off humid even for October, the air thick with the smell of wet peat and pine needles drifting over from the tree line, and the dozen or so people who'd shown up mostly stood in the shade of the courthouse oak, waiting for the handful of actual farmland parcels further up the list. Nobody much expected the bog to draw a bid at all. It hadn't. The previous 4 years running, Verna Kettering arrived on foot, having parked her 10-year-old Subaru with a cracked windshield 2 blocks over to avoid the parking fee a church group was charging that morning for a separate fundraiser, and stood at the back of the small crowd in a field jacket with a county wetland survey map folded into a back pocket nobody could see. She'd graduated with a master's degree in wetland ecology from North Carolina State 6 years earlier. Spent most of those years doing contract survey work for environmental consulting firms across the coastal plain, and lost her most recent position 11 weeks before that auction when the firm downsized its field staff after losing a state contract. The unemployment checks had stopped covering rent 2 months in, and she'd been sleeping on a friend's couch in a hosky since September. telling most people she was between contracts rather than between everything. She had $400 left in a checking account that was mostly already spoken for, and a torn 20 in her coat pocket that had survived a wash cycle the week before. The only cash she'd let herself carry that morning, on the theory that having less to lose made for a clearer head. Nobody in that crowd recognized her. Nobody had any particular reason to. The auctioneer worked through the morning's better parcels first, the way he always did, saving the bog for last, because nothing about it ever moved fast. When he finally got to Spivey's Folly, he didn't waste much breath on the pitch. He read the acreage, noted the county's running carrying cost on the parcel, nearly $1,100 a year in surveys, insurance liability, and administrative overhead for a piece of ground that generated exactly $0 in usable revenue, and set the opening bid at $20, a number low enough to be almost a joke, because the county genuinely just wanted it gone. A couple of people laughed. One man near the front, a local timber buyer named Curtis Revel, who'd looked at draining sections of the bog for pulpwood twice in his career and walked away both times, said loud enough for the row behind him to hear that the county ought to pay somebody to take it, not the other way around. "Tell you what," he said, grinning at the men nearest him, "I'll throw in a six-pack if somebody wants to haul it off my conscience, too." A few people laughed at that. Verna didn't. She raised her hand instead. The auctioneer, mildly surprised, called the number once, twice, and brought the gavel down before anybody else in that crowd had so much as considered raising a competing bid. A ripple of low conversation went through the crowd, more confusion than laughter this time. The kind of murmur that follows something nobody quite expected to actually happen. $20 for 700 acres came out to less than 3 cents an acre, and every person standing on that courthouse lawn who did that particular math decided it confirmed everything they already believed about Spivey's Folly. What none of them knew, because there wasn't any reason for an eastern North Carolina timber buyer to know it, was that the very qualities that made the bog worthless for farming or forestry were the same qualities that made it valuable for something almost nobody in Bertie County had ever heard of. Verna had spent the better part of her career mapping wetland disturbance across the coastal plain, and she knew, the way a person knows a fact they've spent years staring at without anybody asking them about it, that nearly every Pocosin wetland left in that part of the state had already been ditched, drained, or logged at some point in the past 60 years, fragmented into smaller and smaller patches by decades of agriculture and forestry. Most of what passed for wetland on a modern survey map was a remnant, a corner left over after the rest had been cleared, rarely large enough or undisturbed enough to support the full range of species a healthy bog complex once held. A genuinely intact Pocosin complex of 700 contiguous acres, undisturbed enough to still support the full range of native shrub and bog vegetation, had become rare enough across the region that it carried a kind of value the county's tax assessor had no column for. Under federal wetland regulations, any developer disturbing wetland acreage elsewhere, a highway widening, a port expansion, a new subdivision cutting through a marsh, was required by law to offset that damage by funding the preservation or restoration of equivalent wetlands somewhere else, purchased in the form of mitigation credits from a certified mitigation bank. The math behind it ran roughly the opposite direction of everything Spivey's Folly had ever been valued by. A farmer wanted dry ground that drained well and grew a crop. A mitigation bank wanted exactly the opposite: wet, intact, undisturbed ground that had never been touched. The rarer and more pristine the better, because scarcity was the entire engine driving the price of a credit. An intact site the size of Spivey's Folly, properly surveyed and certified, wasn't a liability. It was inventory, sitting untouched on the county's books for 60 years precisely because nobody had ever managed to ruin it the way the rest of the region's wetlands had been ruined. Verna didn't have a mentor walking her through any of this. Not in the way some people might expect, and she'd gotten used to people assuming there had to be one. A professor, or a father, or somebody standing behind her with the real knowledge. There wasn't. She'd learned it the ordinary way, in graduate coursework and 4 years of fieldwork that had never once felt like it was leading anywhere in particular until the morning she stood on that courthouse lawn doing math nobody else in the crowd had any reason to do. She'd thought about that $20 opening bid for most of the week leading up to the auction. Ever since she'd pulled the surplus list off the county website on a library computer between job applications and recognized the parcel number from an old disturbance survey she'd worked on 3 years before. She remembered standing at the edge of that bog with a clipboard back then, noting, almost as an aside in her own field notes, how unusually undisturbed the interior of the tract looked compared to everything around it. She hadn't thought much more about it at the time. Filed it away the way a person files away 100 small observations that never go anywhere. The number $20 brought the thought back fast enough. The certification process took the better part of a year, longer than Verna's checking account strictly allowed for, and she covered the gap working temp survey contracts for 2 of her old colleagues, the same kind of work that had let her go 11 weeks before the auction. She filed the mitigation banking instrument herself, with help from a former professor named Dr. Alma Rocha, who reviewed her application on the side for the cost of dinner twice a month. The 2 of them working through state and federal paperwork at Alma's kitchen table most Sunday evenings. The process required a full hydrology assessment, a vegetation survey broken into dozens of plots across the tract, a wildlife corridor study, and a credit release schedule that took 3 separate revisions before the state's review board accepted it without further comment. Each round of comments arriving by mail weeks apart, and forcing Verna to rework sections she'd thought were finished months before. Verna spent most weekends out on the property alone that year, documenting hydrology and vegetation plots with a county-issued access permit and a GPS unit she'd bought second-hand off a retiring surveyor in Edenton, sleeping some Saturday nights in the back of the Subaru rather than driving the hour back to a Husky and losing daylight the next morning. She kept a single spiral notebook for the project, the pages swollen and warped from humidity by the time the year was out, filled with soil saturation readings and species counts in a shorthand only she could fully read. Curtis Revell saw her out there a handful of times that year, wading through standing water in chest waders with a clipboard, and mentioned to a few people around town that the Kettering woman seemed awfully determined to do something with ground that had broken better men than her. Not unkind, just the kind of comment a man makes about a thing he doesn't yet have a reason to take seriously. The bank received preliminary certification from the state in the late summer of the following year, and the first interested party to come calling wasn't a private developer at all. It was the North Carolina Department of Transportation, midway through planning a widening project on a stretch of Highway 40 miles south that was going to disturb several hundred acres of lower-quality wetland along its corridor. Wetland the department was legally obligated to offset before the project could break ground. A department engineer named Pete Sessoms drove out from Raleigh that September to walk the property himself, spent the better part of a day with Verna going over hydrology data and vegetation surveys, asking the kind of pointed, skeptical questions a man asks when a 6-figure decision rides on what he sees with his own eyes, stopping every quarter mile or so to take his own soil sample and compare it against the figures in her report. He stopped at one point in the middle of the bog, looked around at the unbroken stretch of shrub and standing water in every direction, and asked her flat out how a tract this size and this intact had managed to sit untouched for so long so close to a state highway. Nobody wanted it, Verna told him. That's the whole reason it's worth something now. Sessoms didn't have much to say to that at first. He just kept walking, taking his own notes, double-checking soil cores against the figures in her report. By the end of the day, he'd stopped asking questions, like a man trying to catch an error, and started asking them like a man trying to confirm one wasn't there. His clipboard filling with notes he kept underlining twice. He left, by his own later account, more impressed by the sight than he'd expected to be going in. The department's initial offer covered the first phase of credits generated off 350 of the 700 acres, priced at $18,500 per credit acre, a number that came to something just over $6 million before fees, with the remaining acreage held in reserve for future phases as regional development continued to chew through wetland elsewhere in the coastal plain. Verna read the offer letter twice, standing in Dr. Roche's kitchen, before she said anything out loud about it at all. $20 to $6 million. She ran that particular piece of arithmetic more than once in the weeks after the offer came through, mostly out of habit, sitting at the same library computer where she'd first pulled up the surplus list, and it never once came out smaller no matter how carefully she checked it. Curtis Revell heard about the deal before most of the county did, the way news like that travels through a place that size, and drove out to see the property himself that November, the same way he had twice before. Except this time, he stood at the edge of it a good deal longer than he used to, hands in his pockets, not saying much for a while. He told a few people afterward that he'd misjudged the ground for the better part of 30 years. Standing on its edge looking at exactly the same wet bog everybody else in the county had looked at, and somehow seeing nothing but what it wasn't good for. He wasn't wrong, by the only measure he'd ever had reason to apply. He'd just never had reason to apply any other one. He stopped by Verna's new office that winter, not for any particular business reason, mostly just to tell her in person that he'd been the one cracking the joke about the six-pack on the courthouse lawn, in case she hadn't placed his face, and that he figured he owed her an apology he wasn't entirely sure how to phrase. Verna told him there wasn't anything to apologize for. Everybody on that lawn had looked at the same ground and come to the same conclusion. She just had a reason to ask a different question. Verna used part of the proceeds to start a small wetland consulting and mitigation banking practice out of an office in Windsor, hiring 2 of the same field colleagues who'd kept her on temp contracts during the certification year. Women who knew the work as well as she did and had spent just as long getting passed over for the kind of opportunity that had landed, almost by accident, on Verna's $20 bid. The practice grew slowly at first, the way most things in that part of the state grow. Mostly word of mouth between landowners who'd heard some version of the Spivey's Folly story and wondered, usually a little sheepishly, whether their own back 40 might be worth more wet than dry. She's helped 4 other landowners across the coastal plain since then identify wetland acreage on their own ground worth far more intact than it would ever have been drained or developed. Land that had sat written off in family hands for generations, the same way Spivey's Folly had sat written off by the county. Ground nobody had thought to ask a different question about, until Verna sat across a kitchen table from them with a soil map and a calculator. She kept the bog's old name on the property records, mostly out of a stubborn sense that the joke deserved to outlive the people who'd made it, and had a small wooden sign made for the gate that simply read Spivey's Folly, Est, 1962, leaving anybody curious enough to ask the rest of the story themselves. Hazel Tillery still runs the Register of Deeds office in Windsor, and she'll tell you, if you bring it up, that she watched Spivey's Folly cross her counter every October for 15 years without once imagining what it was actually sitting on. She still keeps the old auction ledger from that October in a drawer at her desk. The $20 sale entered in her own handwriting on a line that looks, on paper, exactly like every other forgettable line above and below it, sandwiched between a half-acre lot near the river and a landlocked corner parcel that finally sold for scrap value the following spring. She pulls the ledger out now and then when somebody asks about the story, mostly newer county employees who've heard some version of it secondhand, and shows them the entry without much fanfare. The same way a person points out a spot on a wall where something important once happened. Ordinary now, marked only because somebody bothered to remember it. There wasn't anything special about that ground, Curtis Revelle says now, when people ask him how he could have missed it for 30 years. There was just somebody who finally looked at it and asked a different question than everybody before her had thought to ask.